On this episode of Faith and Focus, I want to talk about the character Elihu from the book of Job. This is a series we've been doing at our Friday night home group, and we just recently went through the Elihu section. And it's a lot of chapters, so we're not going to do a lot of reading, and I'm going to have to obviously fill in a lot of content, but that's what I hope to get into because I think Elihu is the guy who gets it the most right in the book of Job, and I think you'll be excited, as I was, to see what he has to say. Alrighty, well, again, welcome back to Faith and Focus. And if you're not a subscriber on YouTube or Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen, you should subscribe now and comment, do all that stuff that you do with the social medias. It really helps out the show. And of course, if you like what you hear, you can text the word discipleship to 41444. You can donate to my ministry within Faith. You can also go to infaith.org and search me there. Go to the link in the show description and find a link. Again, any amount of support is helpful. It allows me to make content like this. It also supports my ministry that isn't just this online stuff. I do counseling. I teach the Bible in my local church. I do even the finances at my local church. Like I said, I do counseling. Kind of got my hands in a lot of different things. Do a lot of discipleship and Bible teaching. But this online format is just one of those ways in which I do my ministry within Faith. So your support is very appreciated and welcomed. So, as I said, I want to talk about Elihu. And you might think, Elihu? Exactly, Elihu. And he is this character in the book of Job. Now, again, we're jumping into the main section, the wisdom part of the book of Job. So, of course, you're missing all of the context. You're missing all of the good stuff. But if I can take just a few minutes to bring you up to speed on what's going on in the book of Job. Now, most everyone knows the story of the book of Job, or the story of the narrative of what happens. Job is this guy who's righteous. I mean, we're told right at the outset he's a righteous guy. He's not doing anything wrong. And yet, Satan comes to God and says, well, hey, what about Job here? He's only doing this good stuff because you're blessing him, God. And Satan is, of course, reflecting a belief that we as people still hold. We think that if I do good, God is obligated to bless me. And if I do bad, God is obligated to punish me, or will likely punish me. And that's the voice of Satan. So God kind of gives permission to Satan to basically wreck Job's life. Now, this isn't God doing it, it's Satan doing it, but of course God allows it. So this kind of gets into the discussion about, God's sovereignty and stuff, but we're not going to get into that stuff. And it's not really relevant to the point. In fact, I think sometimes that obscures the point, the wisdom that the book of Job has to offer. So Job loses everything. He loses all of his wealth. He loses all of his animals, his crops, his livestock. He loses his health. He loses his children, everything. And he's just sitting on an ash pit. And of course, his three friends then come and they start offering it advice. And for the first half of the book, there is this argument going back and forth between Job's three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and Job. So they'll argue back and forth. Eliphaz will say something, Job will respond. Bildad says something, Job responds. Zophar says something, Job responds. So they go back and forth 3 times, and they're trying to figure out what is going on. And they are mining for wisdom, essentially. They're mining to the depths of their wisdom and understanding why this is happening. And what I've been teaching through, and of course this is not a thought that's original with me, but what they're arguing about is this triangle, this triad, and you can think in one corner is a view of karma. If you do bad things are going to happen to you from God. If you do good, God's going to do good things for you. That's this one belief that these people hold. And we, of course, as people believe a version of this, but they held that belief. And they believed in the existence of God, but then they also believed in Job. And so Job's the central character, and it's his righteousness and goodness or wickedness that's on trial here. So these 3 things are kind of in tension. And this is what they're arguing about. And Job's friends are saying, Job, we believe so firmly in this view of karma that if something bad's happening to you, you must have earned it. And of course, they start accusing him of all these wicked things that he's done. And they're saying, I didn't do any of this stuff. This is not wrong. So they're taking their stand in this corner of the karma. And to do so, they have to diminish Job's righteousness and accuse him unjustly. Job is in the other corner saying, well, no, I'm innocent. But he sometimes still concedes to this view of karma. But he says, I'm innocent. I don't know what's going on. So he's kind of more wrestling with God and trying to understand what God is doing. So that's the whole drama of the first half of the book. And then in chapter 28, there is a chapter where wisdom basically interjects. Sometimes your Bible will attribute this to Job, but it really fits more that it's more just like the narrator. Now, maybe Job's the writer and he's the narrator interjecting this after the fact, but it's this wisdom. Wisdom interjects and says, finding wisdom is like mining for treasure. People dig down into the earth looking for treasure. And of course, they pull up a lot of valuable stuff. And that's what these friends are doing and Job's doing. They're digging down deep looking for wisdom. But as it concludes in chapter 28, wisdom is found by fearing the Lord, honoring the Lord, and respecting the Lord. That, of course, mirrors what we see in Proverbs, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. If you're going to go out searching for wisdom and dig down deep for this treasure, you better start from the principle that God is God, I am man, and that's just the way things are. So that's what's going on. And then Job doesn't really have a discussion with his friends anymore. Job basically after that stakes himself in the ground, was a flag in the ground, in saying, I am righteous. This principle that righteous people should be being blessed and not cursed, he still kind of believes in that, and he knows he's righteous. So by default, he accuses God. And he thinks God, in this triangle, God must be the one who's wrong. He's the one who's acting unjustly because he's breaking the rules. He's punishing me when he should be rewarding me. That's kind of where Job ends up landing. Now, then this character Elihu comes in, and he speaks for a lot of chapters. But I think what he says, he is the voice of wisdom coming in. He doesn't get everything right, and people wonder who Elihu is. We don't really know. He's just a young guy who let everyone else speak first, but he's going to come in, and his position is going to be to stake his corner in that triangle, not with the principle of karma, not with Job's righteousness, but he's going to stand in God's corner and say, no, fearing the Lord is where you need to stand. And so, of course, he's going to accuse Job of things that Job's not necessarily guilty of, because if he's standing in the corner from God's perspective, he has limited knowledge. He thinks, well, Job, you must have done something, or maybe you were going to do something. And so he kind of holds on to the principle, a little bit of retribution and karma, but he is primarily standing in for God, and he's going to introduce, basically almost as a literary device, he's going to introduce God. So I want to breeze through Elihu. We did this when we did it. We just read through all the chapters and we're commenting. I'm not going to read through all 6 chapters, but I want to highlight a couple things. So, and if you're just listening, of course you can listen along, but if you're watching, I've got the text up here on the screen. So it says, there's 3 men refused to answer Job, and then Elihu, son of Barachel the Buzite of the family of Ram, became very angry. He was angry with Job for justifying himself rather than God. With Job's 3 friends, he was also angry because they could not find an answer, and so they declared Job guilty. So Elihu, again, he's angry because Job ended up justifying himself. He was being self-righteous rather than attribute to God. Basically, this idea is that, like, hey, if one of the 2 of us is going to be wrong, God or me, the fear of the Lord would say, okay, I'm going to distrust myself before I'm going to distrust God, right? Okay, so we've got Elihu comes in, and I'm not going to really read any of this first section. He basically just is like poetry. If you read poetry, it repeats a lot. There's just a lot of repetition. Elihu's basically just like, I didn't want to talk. I was young. I was waiting my turn. I was being respectful. But now I got to talk now. Now I need to jump in here. So that's basically what he's saying to them. But he says, he talks about, I do not know how to give honorary titles. If I did, my creator would quickly do away with me. Elihu's saying, I'm not going to flatter anyone. I'm just going to speak truth. And he's speaking truth again from the perspective of honoring God, glorifying God, and fearing the Lord. So he says in chapter 33, he says, but now, O Job, listen to my words. And again, he's not dialoguing with Job. Job never responds to Elihu. He's just talking to Job. He says, hear everything I have to say. See, I've opened my mouth. He says in verse 7, there should be no fear of me. Therefore, no fear of me should terrify you, nor should my pressure be heavy on you. He says, I'm just like you. So he's being humble. He's saying, Job, I'm not saying that I'm better than you in any way. And he says in verse 8, indeed, you have said in my hearing, I've heard the sound of the words, I'm pure. I'm without transgression. I am clean and have no iniquity. Yet God finds occasion with me. He regards me as his enemy. He puts my feet in shackles. He watches closely over my paths. Now in this is Elihu speaking again. Now in this you are not right. I answer you, for God is greater than a human being. Why do you contend against him, that he does not answer all a person's words? And so Elihu's point is, listen, Job, and again, we know that Job is righteous. We know that that's true. The Bible starts out by telling us Job is righteous in this. So Job isn't wrong, but his position is one of he's trusting himself more than he would trust God. And Elihu is saying, listen, God is not like you, Job. He's above you. He's higher than you. Ultimately, Elihu's point is going to be, Job, God is righteous. That means he's just. That means he is right. So by default, you've got to be wrong, Job. You need to be humble. And then he says in verse 14, seems a little strange, but he says, for God speaks the first time in one way, the second time in another. Though a person does not perceive it, in a dream, a night vision, when a deep sleep falls on a person as they sleep in their beds. Then he gives a revelation to people and terrifies them with warnings to turn a person from his sin, to cover a person's pride. He spares a person's life from corruption, his very life from crossing over the river. Or a person is chastened by pain on his bed, and with the continual strife of his bones, so that his life loathes food and his soul rejects appetizing fare. His flesh wastes away from sight. His bones, which were not seen, are easily visible. So what Elihu is doing here, and it's kind of a little strange, and again, we didn't go through Job, but earlier in the book of Job, Eliphaz is staking his claim on his wisdom, on Eliphaz's wisdom. And he says, I had a dream, I had a vision in the night where a spirit passed by my face and I could see the form of it, and I heard a voice, and I heard whatever. So he's talking about some vision, some dream that he had, and he's, saying there's some wisdom for you, Job, in this vision I have. And that's what I think Elihu is referring to. Listen, God speaks one way. Sometimes he speaks in dreams and visions. Sometimes he speaks through a prophet, calling people to account. Sometimes he speaks through what Job is going through right now. And so he describes the person who's just wasting away, right? And what I think one of the first tidbits of wisdom that Elihu is offering is that you can't, to use the cliched phrase, you can't put God into a box, right? God isn't a system that you can just box him into. He's not an automaton. He's not an AI. He's not a robot. You cannot say, here is how God acts in every single given situation. If you put the right money in, the right thing's going to come out. If you give it the right prompt, the right response is going to come back. God's a person. God's an intelligence. He's a rational being. And he's also God. So he's the one speaking to us. And so when you look at this kind of thing, you have to realize that one of the things that Elihu is saying is that you might have a person who is unrighteous, they're an evil, rotten sinner, but they seem to be being blessed by God. Maybe God is blessing that person and showing grace and mercy because God knows that person and is wanting to speak to them in the most effective way possible. So would it be right to say God blesses and honors and shows grace and mercy to wicked sinners? Well, sometimes he does. Well, what if a wicked sinner, horrible, no good, rotten person, is being completely drugged through the mud, they're suffering? People might say, God judges and punishes wicked people. Well, not always, because some he doesn't do. But maybe God knows what this person needs is a wake-up call and to be kind of shaken out of their stupor to wake them up. And that's what God's doing. Now, maybe you've got somebody who's righteous, like Job, living for the Lord, all this kind of stuff. So maybe Maybe God's gracious and he's blessing them and things are going well. Would it be right to conclude that if you always do good, God will bless you? Well, no, because he doesn't always do that. But maybe God is saying, I want to show grace to this person. I do want to honor them. They're living for me. I love that and I want to encourage that. But then sometimes righteous people like Job suffer and go through hardships. And God might be speaking through that as well, saying, hey, here's something that's coming along in your life, and I want to speak through this to you. So Elihu is saying, listen, God in one way might speak this way, might speak another way. You can't form a system based on this kind of stuff. That's the voice of Satan. Remember, it was Satan who said, God, you're blessing Job, and so he's doing righteousness, and he's doing righteousness, so you're blessing him. But break that system, and he'll curse you, he'll reject you, he'll do all this kind of stuff. That's the voice of the enemy who says you can put God into a system and into a box like that. So that's one thing that Elihu is saying, which I think is very insightful. He goes on in chapter 34. Listen to my words, you wise men. Hear, you learned men. Job says, I'm innocent, but God turns away my right. Concerning my right, should I lie? My wound is incurable, although I am without transgression. Who is there like Job, who drinks derision like water? He goes about in company with evildoers. He goes along with the wicked men. For he says, it does not profit a man when he makes his delight with God. And then, so he's analyzing the things that Job has said. But then Elihu comes in with this rebuke. He says, therefore listen to me, you men of understanding. Far be it from God to do wickedness, from the Almighty to do evil. For he repays a person for his work, and according to the conduct of a person, he causes the consequences to find him. So again, he's got a little bit of that principle, like, God operates this way. But one of the things that's important that Elihu's doing, and I made the point of mentioning this, is like this karma law is a principle, but it's not a universal. It's not an absolute. So if we're looking at, a person like Job, he's suffering. And maybe he's righteous, he's done nothing wrong. But we can look at it and say, you know what? If I'm a betting man, I'm going to bet on, Job, you probably did something to deserve this. Because in general, if you live a righteous life, you don't seem to be going through the things that you're going through. So it's more of a hierarchy. It's not a triangle of things that are equal. It's a hierarchy where it's like, I'm going to maybe think, Job, you probably did something wrong here. Generally, God seems to bless people who are doing well, punishes people who are not. But no matter what, Elihu's saying at the top is God. God, far be it from God to do wickedness. That's the one thing. When we speak of the fear of the Lord, that's the one thing we're never going to question. He is at the top. Everything else has to get filtered through that lens that God does not do unrighteousness. He does not do wickedness. And he goes on to say, indeed, in truth, God does not act wickedly, and the Almighty does not pervert justice. Who entrusted to him the earth, and who put him over the whole world? If God were to set his heart on it and gather in his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together, and all human beings would return to dust. So nobody put God in charge. God is sovereign. God created this thing. And I think that's significant. God is the creator. That means he's right. That means we subject ourselves to him. I see it a lot, and I think that it's a result of people going through what Job goes through and not having an Elihu to come in with the voice of reason, or not listening maybe to that person. Continuing on with the way Job is headed, but thankfully he repents at the end and honors God. So, but I think people will suffer, things will go hard for them, and God's not opposed to you arguing with him. He's not opposed to you questioning and really trying to understand and being angry at the situation. But when people say, I'm done following God because he didn't, this bad thing happened to me. or these bad circumstances came into my life, or I served God faithfully and I didn't get what I think that I was owed. Well, implicit in that, what you're saying is, you, God, have not done things righteously. If you had, you would have fill in the blank. You would have done things this way, the way I say things should happen. A lot of critics of God and Christianity and faith will say things like this: I would never follow God because he does X, Y, and Z. And in Romans 9, Paul addresses that a little bit. He says, well, first of all, who are you to talk back to God? You are the clay, he's the potter. Now, I don't think that means God does wickedness. I agree with Elihu. God does not do wickedness. Or, in James, when he says, God only gives good gifts and God doesn't tempt people to do evil, and none of that kind of stuff. There's enough sources of wickedness in this world. We don't need to blame God for them. But to question God and to put him on trial, which is what Job is doing, that is the opposite of wisdom. That's the opposite of fearing God. It is the opposite of what Elihu's doing, what Elihu's saying, rather, when he says, who entrusted to God the earth, and who put him over the whole world? Nobody did. God created the world. He created all of this. And if he wanted to, he could wipe us out without even thinking about it. He says, if you have understanding, listen to this. Hear what I have to say. Do you really think that one who hates justice can govern? And will you declare guilty the supremely righteous one? Who says to a king, worthless man, and to nobles, wicked man? Who shows no partiality to princes and does not take note of the rich more than the poor, because all of them are the work of his hands? And so, again, you think of the universe. You think of the creativity that had to go into the universe. You think of the power and the wisdom that has to go into running this whole thing. And you're going to question the God who made all of this and holds it all together? Elihu's saying, could somebody who's not just or wicked actually do this? Like, you're wicked. Put yourself in God's shoes. Could you do that? Like, you can't even keep your life together, let alone run a universe. And I think Elihu is in part saying, he's speaking on behalf of God. You know what? When you create a universe, run it the way you want, but I'm running this one because it's the one that I made. Now, of course, Elihu's defending God. He's speaking in broad generalizations, but his ultimate point is, if it's you, Job, or God, I'm siding with God 100% of the time. That's the fear of the Lord. That's reverencing the Lord. So Job is foolish to rebel. Has anyone said to God, I have endured chastisement, but I will not act wrongly anymore? Teach me what I cannot see. If I have done evil, I will do so no more. Is your opinion that God should recompense it because you reject this? But you must choose and not I, so tell us what you know. And so Elihu basically says, Job, this is on you. And the way I described it is, you can't faith for somebody else. If somebody's going through a hard time, you can encourage them, and you should encourage them. You should put your arm around them. But it's ultimately on them. Elihu's saying, Job, you're the one who has to make this decision. You're the one who has to choose to submit yourself to God and humble yourself to God. Elihu can't do it for Job. He's the one who has to go through this. And then in verse 35, or chapter 35, he says, do you think this to be just when you say my right before God? But you say, what will it profit you? And what do I gain by not sinning? I will reply to you and to your friends with you. Gaze at the heavens and see. Consider the clouds which are higher than you. If you sin, how does it affect God? If your transgressions are many, what does it do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give to God? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness affects only a person like yourself, and your righteousness only other people. And so I think that is really profound what Elihu is saying here. Um, again, when we have this mentality of things are not right in the world, and you know what, God, you're the one that screwed up. You're the one who messed this whole thing up, which is essentially what Job is saying in his own life. Things are not going the way I think that they should have gone. God, you're the one who's wrong. Again, that is foolish talking. It's foolish because it's the opposite of fearing God and reverencing God, which is what wisdom is. And so when you're saying my right before God, my righteousness, my justice, me before God, um, that's foolishness, first of all. And then when he says, look up at the heavens and see, consider the clouds which are higher than you. And then you look up at the stars and you just think, God is so much farther above me. His wisdom, his power, his might, so infinitely higher than I am. And Elihu kind of keys in on that. He says, if you sin, how does it affect God? Like, this is a God who can speak the universe into existence. You sin, what is God's up there? It's like shooting a BB gun at an asteroid. It's not going to do anything to God. God is not affected in the slightest when you sin. And so when we think, you know, the God's gonna God has to come down and judge wickedness, and that's the rule. God has to do that because you sinned. And God's up there sitting there thinking, I don't have to do anything. This does not affect me one way or the other. Your sin's affecting yourself. You're destroying yourself and you're destroying other people. Same thing with the righteousness. On the flip side, we think, I'm serving God and I'm living for God, so he has to bless me. And Elihu says, like, why does God need your righteousness? What does that do for him? The scriptures say, God does not live in tents made by human hands. He's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. And God even says, if I needed anything, I certainly wouldn't tell you people. So the fact that we think God needs us to serve him, so then he's obligated to bless us, not the case. God doesn't need anything from us and he's not affected by us. Now, it is true God is upset and angry at sin, but I think this shows the character of God. God is not, when we think God's judgment, he's such a mean God, he's not acting because he's like, you've personally done something to hurt me and I'm going to react and get you back. Your sin doesn't do anything to God. Doesn't bother him one bit. But he loves people so much and he loves his creation so much that he is upset on an infinite, holy, righteous level because your sin has impacted somebody else that he loves and cares about. That's what Elihu is saying. So this whole idea that God has to stoop down from heaven to either judge sin because sin's bad or bless me because I'm righteous or whatever, you don't have to do any of that stuff. So he continues on in his last speech. This one goes on for a couple chapters, but Elihu said further, be patient with me a little bit longer, and I'll instruct you. With my knowledge, I'll speak comprehensively, and to my Creator I will ascribe righteousness. So that's Elihu's position. I'm going to start from the premise that God is the one who's right. For in truth, my words are not false. It is one complete in knowledge who is with you. He says, indeed, God is mighty. He does not despise people. He's mighty, firm in his intent. He does not allow wicked to live, but he gives justice to the poor. He doesn't take his eyes off the righteous. So again, he's attributing this a little bit to the view of karma. In verse 10, he says, he reveals this for correction and says that they must turn from evil. So again, even a lot of God's rebukes are for corrective purposes. But again, not always. Sometimes he's just, judging. But verse 7, if they obey and serve him, they live out their days in prosperity and their years in pleasantness. But if they refuse, they pass over the river of death and expire without knowledge. So I think part of this is, and he said earlier to Job, Job, if you respond correctly, God can redeem you back from crossing over the river of death and entering into death. He's telling Job, you're still not too far gone. You can come back from this. And I do think that is in part some of the wisdom that comes from the book of James. Is that when you're suffering, you can ask God for wisdom and he will give it to you. He has promised to give it to you. And all the book of James is talking about us responding correctly, responding in the correct way to suffering. And of course, if we respond righteously, James says we've got this crown of life. We can enjoy eternal life. But if we don't, then we're going to suffer further. We're going to suffer from that. So I think Elihu is even saying, Job, you can respond correctly and God can bring you back. Yes, God is great beyond our knowledge. The number of his years is unsearchable. He draws up the drops of water. They distill the rain into mist, which the clouds pour down. And what Elihu starts to do is he starts to talk about the marvelousness of God's character. He starts thinking about, water going up into the sky and forming clouds and then coming back down, and thundering where it needs to, and lightning striking exactly where it needs to. He's kind of marveling in the fact that God knows how to do this stuff. It's incredible. It's like, I don't know how the water cycle works. I don't know. I look up at clouds and I just think, that's water up there. How is it staying up there? Eventually it gets to a point where it falls, and that's, rain and precipitation, but it's like, how is it staying up there? I have no idea how that works. And Elihu is starting to observe this stuff. And what he's actually doing, and it's a very poetic and cool thing, is he starts to describe this thunderstorm, lightning striking, rain downpouring, all this kind of stuff. And then when you get into 37, he says, "At this also my heart pounds and leaps from its place. Listen carefully to the thunder of his voice, to the rumbling that proceeds from his mouth. Under the whole heaven he lets it go, even as lightning to the far corners of the earth. After that a voice roars, he thunders with an exalt." And so what Elihu is doing is he's describing this storm. Pay attention to this, Job. Listen to this storm that's incoming. Stand still and consider the wonders God works. And then he starts to basically speak the voice of God. And this is what I mean. In the book of Job, at the end, when God finally comes in, Job the whole time has been saying, I want to stand before God and I want to plead my case and prove to God that I'm right. By default, God's wrong. I'm going to take him to court. I'm the plaintiff. He's the defendant, and I'm going to win. When God shows up, God doesn't answer any of Job's questions. Instead, he asks him over 100 questions back. Do you understand how the universe is created? Do you understand how planets are formed? Do you understand how rain falls? Do you understand where snow is kept before it falls to the ground? Do you understand how animals give birth and tend to their young? Do you understand how he just fires all of these questions at Job? And Elihu, it's amazing, starts to do that. He starts to do that here at the end. And he's doing it as the storm is rolling in. You can almost, as you read it, he's describing the storm coming in. And he says, stand still and consider the works of God. Do you know how God commands them? How he makes lightning flash in his storm? Do you know about the balancing of clouds, the wondrous activity of him who is perfect in knowledge? You whose garments are hot when the earth is still because of the south wind, will you with him spread out the clouds, solid as a mirror of molten metal? I love that he says, you, Job, your clothes are like subject to the storms of the earth. Just all the way down to what you're wearing. You're at the mercy of the storm and the weather. You're going to be the one to tell God how he creates the weather. Verse 20 says, should he be informed that I want to speak? If a man speaks, surely he will be swallowed up. But now the sun cannot be looked at. It's bright in the skies. After a wind passed, swept the clouds away. From the north, he comes in golden splendor. Around God is awesome majesty. As for the Almighty, we cannot attain to him. He is great in power. Again, this is the fear of the Lord. Elihu's spouting it. And then it says, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel? And so Elihu plays this role of somebody who in the end starts asking questions. Job, do you really think that you can be righteous before God? Do you really understand how the earth is formed, the foundations of the earth? Do you really understand it? So he starts asking these questions. And I really think that when God shows up, speaking out of the storm and out of this thunderous cloud, he puts the fear of God into Job and to his friends. but he never answers Job's questions. Now, I don't think that means that God will never have answers to why things happen the way that they happen. But the wisdom that Job is trying to teach us, and the voice that Elihu is trying to offer, is if you're looking for wisdom in the midst of suffering, you have to start from the premise that God is God and that God is righteous. No matter what, you put your system aside, put your law reasoning aside, even put your grace. We have, sometimes we rail against law focused and we think, well, we're just all grace, grace, grace. Put that aside, because God's not constrained by that system either. God will answer how he answers and speak the way he wants to speak, and that will be in different ways, different forms, different situations with different people. You see that with Christ. Sometimes we look at Christ, and I've talked about this before. We'll look at Christ and say, oh, see, this is how you must respond to a woman you meet at a well, who's been married 4 times, and the man she's with now is not her husband. This is how you must respond. And it's like, well, that's how Jesus responded to that Samaritan woman at that time in John chapter 4. That doesn't mean Jesus would always respond to a woman in a similar situation the same way. Maybe he'll rebuke. Maybe he'll sternly command. Maybe he'll just not say anything to her. Jesus is a person. God is a person. And we are people. So God is going to act with us on that basis. Not like a system, not like a robot. But the fear of the Lord is wisdom. To reverence God and put him in his proper place. We are not the ones who have the right to subject God to our righteousness. We are not allowed to have the privilege of being in the position to say, I'm right, God, you must be wrong. And that's at the heart of a lot of these ex-evangelicals, these people that leave the faith, is something happened in my life or the life of someone I love, and God either caused it, God allowed it, and God ultimately screwed up and did something unrighteous or wicked or careless or irresponsible or something I just plain didn't like. Again, you can be upset with God, you can be frustrated, but what you can't do is put yourself in the place of God. You aren't God. You didn't create the universe. The shirt on your back is subject to the power of God. So that, I think, is a great piece of wisdom from Elihu. And again, Elihu, he's the voice of wisdom, and he's coming to God's defense. And I would just encourage you with those words. If you're going through hardship, don't put God on trial. God is God. Respect him and fear him and honor him. Seek wisdom like a miner would seek out gold. And James says he will give it to you. Have a good one. While Faith in Focus is a ministry of mine as a missionary within faith, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast or lived out by guests on this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of In Faith as a mission.